Aston Martin is not like other car companies. Jaguar, for example, has lost its identity for the 1000th time. Lotus does not simplify or add lightness anymore. A TRD badge now means Toyota reluctantly decorated your dad's car. And Mitsubishi, well, Mitsubishi peaked with the Evo 9. But there is one car company that never stopped being cool. A company that hasn't thrown its heritage out the window for quarterly reports or focus groups. A company that no matter how bad things got, they were unkillable. Aston Martin. And how they did it involved a careful balance between staying true to their legacy and constantly innovating. Hopefully this video doesn't age like milk or honey. From the very beginning, Aston Martin was about making quality cars and then proving that quality on the racetrack. The company was founded by two Englishmen, Lionel Martin and Robert Bamford. The first guy, Lionel, was always a competitor. In 1902, while in college, he broke records on his bicycle, taking 22 hours to go across the UK, a record that was previously 25 hours. And when he finally got into a car, he lost his driver's license for 2 years because of speeding. Not really a big deal though, because a bike was probably faster than a car back then. But it was during that driving ban that he met Robert Bamford, and the two of them became fast friends who loved to race, either in sidecars across town or in motorcycles at hill climb events. Lionel Martin's favorite event being the Aston Clinton hill climb. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a little foreshadowing. Little did they know that in less than a decade, those hill climbs would elevate to Grands Prix. Side note, plural to Grand Prix is Grands Prix, not Grand Prix, Grand Prixes, Grand Priuses, Grands. Anyways, eventually they went into business together, forming Bamford and Martin Limited, where they sold cars from Singer Motors. Not the Singer you're probably thinking of, a different Singer. But regardless, after a while they realized the cars they were selling were kinda underwhelming, and that they could probably make a better car themselves. So they made a car, the Cole Scuddy. And as excellent of a name that was, the car would officially be registered as the AM 4656. And AM stood for their new company name, Aston Martin. Now the Cole Scuddy was cool and all, but when I say this was their first car, I mean their one singular car. Like, it would be years before they made a second car. They had good reason though. They both went to fight in World War I. But after they got back from fighting the good fight, Bamford and Martin used that same platform to build their first car for racing. And that thing was fast. They even won gold in the 1919 London to Edinburgh trial, and importantly, the success of that car eventually led to more of them being produced. Aston Martin was slowly picking up steam, well on their way to becoming a legitimate car maker. But as things were picking up at Aston Martin HQ, co-founder Robert Bamford wanted out. He didn't like the direction that Martin was taking the company. The idea of mass-producing cars just didn't convince him. Although, maybe he was ahead of the curve and knew something the public didn't, to be honest. More on that later. Uh-oh. Looks like your browser's acting up again. How many tabs do you have open? This wouldn't be happening if you were using Opera One R2. Opera One R2 is the next generation of web browser from Opera. And not only is it fast enough to support your tab hoarding problem, it's also full of amazing features, like a built-in media player. You can quickly and easily play your favorite songs by hovering over the player icon, and even pop out the music player to take it with you, inside Opera or even outside the browser. If you have actual work to get done, you can work on two separate pages in a single browser window. Just drag the tab over and Opera will show both tabs side by side. Or you could use it to watch two Albon videos at once. I ain't gonna judge. Plus, Opera's tab islands lets you expand and collapse tab groups to stay organized. And tab traces lets you see which tabs you used recently, so you won't end up lost in a sea of marketplace listings for cheap Aston Martins. The darker the underscore, the more recent you were checking it out. And with Opera's built-in AI, Aria, you can use the convenient command line to ask any questions. Plus, thanks to image generation, Aria can generate any image your heart desires, and image recognition can help you discover details in any photo you upload. Plus, Opera has themes where you can customize colors, animations, and personalize your browser to your heart's content. My favorite is Midsummer. You can download Opera One R2 at the link in the description. Now, back at Aston Martin, once Bamford left, Lionel Martin's wife stepped into his place. And at the same time, a man known as Count Louis Zabrowski became involved in the company. And the Count, he was important because the Count was rich AF. And perhaps most importantly, rich enough to take the company racing. And not just your local hill climbs this time, it was time for Grand Prix, baby. Grands Prix, baby. Count Zebrowski commissioned 2 cars to race at the Isle of Man in 1922, but they were delayed and debuted at the French Grand Prix instead. The cars were called the Aston Martin TT1 and TT2. The TT1 had a 1.5-liter 4-cylinder, 16-valve engine that made an exhilarating 55 horsepower, which gave it a top speed of 85 miles per hour, which was very impressive for the time, okay? But none of that mattered because the engine failed after 19 laps. But the TT2 though, well, that also had an engine failure in the same race. And while that was a horrible start, a modified version of that car called the Razor Blade, which is an awesome name for a car and a laptop, went on to break the speed and endurance records at Brooklyn Circuit. And that model became the first ever chassis Aston Martin ever sold to the public. Of course, as cool as these record-breaking sports cars were, Aston only sold 55 cars by 1924, and such low sales numbers meant that they were running out of money. And that's when Dorothea Charnwood, wife of the Lord Godfrey Charnwood, saved the day by investing in Aston Martin, allowing the company to exist off of her funding for the time being, which kind of made Aston Martin basically the British car industry's gigolo at this point, needing rich enthusiasts to basically fund its lavish lifestyle. But that sugar only lasted a year before Aston Martin inevitably went bankrupt. And this time, the Martins had no choice but to sell. But unlike other companies, Jaguar, new ownership wasn't necessarily a bad thing, especially if the new owners shared the same vision. Those new owners were Bill Renwick and Augustus Bertelli. And they were ready to shake things up at this little company because Renwick and Bertelli introduced the Bertelli designed cars that would define Aston Martin from its competitors in the pre-war era. And the Bertelli made cars are iconic in Aston Martin history. The 1.5-liter T-Type, the Mark II, the Le Mans, and the Ulster. And then there was the 2-liter race model called the Super Model, cars that were so significant that they became classics. Well, obviously they're classics, they're 100 years old, but no, I don't mean that classic. I mean classic with a capital C, defined by the Classic Car Club of America as fine or distinctive automobiles, basically cars that are so historically significant because of how impressively engineered or culturally impactful they were. It's an exclusive list, and Bertelli's Aston Martins are all over it. Of course, not quite as exclusive of a list as the Albon Project Cars channel on our Discord server, where you can post your project car and I will 100% roast it. Link below the subscribe button. But see, the magic of Bertelli wasn't just that he was on some list somewhere, he was also on the racing grid, taking 2 of his cars to the 1929 Le Mans, marking the first time an Aston Martin was an official entrant at the big race. They didn't finish the race, of course, but they made it 17 hours in, and 5 hours in the second car, gearbox and suspension issues respectively, but it was still something. However, as great as the Bertelli Astons were, the financial problems didn't just go away. They just weren't selling enough cars to justify the huge budgets building these race cars, so Aston Martin went broke. Again. The company was sold to Lance Prideaux Bruna, who then passed it on to Sir Arthur Sutherland. But it was pretty bad timing for these chaps because, well, World War II. After the war, though, the company was sold, again, to a man named Sir David Brown, arguably the most influential man to ever own Aston. And yet again, another case of ownership going to the right person, because Sir David Brown is DB. DB as in Aston Martin. DB 1, 2, 3, 5, 9, 11, 12. Yes, this absolute mad lad was cocky enough to name his cars with his own initials, and they were very, very successful. David Brown was a machine tools manufacturer for David Brown Limited, a company started by his grandpa, who also liked naming things after himself. So David already had experience growing a company at a large scale, and with that experience, he set out to redefine Aston Martin. The first car sold under his leadership was the Aston Martin 2-liter Sports, a car based on an old prototype, the Atom, that was made during the war. And out the gate, David Brown took that car to the 1948 24 Hours of Spa and won it outright. A tremendous start to the David Brown era, and by the way, that 2-liter Sports would go on to be known as the DB1. And that's because Aston Martin would release its successor in 1950, the DB2. The DB2 was a bigger Grand Tour with a 2.6-liter dual overhead cam straight six made by Lagonda. Lagonda, by the way, that was another car company that David Brown bought around the same time as Aston Martin, and the reason he bought Lagonda was because it meant a certain Lagonda employee would come with it, a man named Walter Owen Bentley. Yes, the Bentley that founded that Bentley. Now, Bentley is a different story, and long story short, Bentley's cars win, and they won because of his engines. David Brown knew that, which is why he put a Bentley-made engine in the DB2. The DB2 prototypes would race at the 1950 Le Mans, winning first and second in the 3-liter classes. The production model was a 2.6-liter two-seater coupe capable of hitting 116 miles per hour and doing 0 to 60 in 11.2 seconds. In 1950, that was pretty fast, all for just 1,914 British pounds, which sounds cheap, but actually I looked it up, it's the equivalent of 84,000 pounds today, so it's actually kind of expensive. And if that wasn't enough, Aston Martin offered an upgrade option, the DB2 Vantage, with larger carbs and a higher compression ratio that pushed the car to 125 horsepower. But if a Grand Tour wasn't your style, then you might prefer the next car, the DB Mark III. These cars were made for racing specifically. It was a key point in the Aston Martin story. The DB3 was made so that Aston Martin could keep up with the likes of Jaguar, Mercedes-Benz, and even Ferrari. Originally, it had the same 2.6-liter Lagonda engine from the DB2 Vantage, but that wasn't near enough to keep up with the other car brands anymore, so Aston Martin shoved a 2.9-liter in that thing that made 163 horsepower. But even with the more powerful engine, they were still falling behind. So the DB3 got another trim level, the DB3S, designed for Le Mans that year in 1953, and well, it sucked. It didn't even finish because of an engine failure 18 hours in. So Aston kept trying to make the DB3S work for a few more years, but just kept falling short where it mattered. It would win outright at events like the Tourist Trophy or Goodwood 9 Hours, but at Le Mans, it would disappoint every single time. But just like 30 seconds ago, I told you the DB3 was important, and it is. And it wasn't because it sucked, it was because in 1959, that Aston Martin DB3S was the template used for the 1959 Le Mans car. You see, in 1959, the rules changed. You didn't need to use road legal cars to race at Le Mans anymore. So Aston Martin turned the DB3S into an all-out race car, the DBR1. And this thing was beautiful. 255 horsepower, a stunning body that weighed less than 1,800 pounds, all the ingredients needed to win races. And a few different DBR1s were made for different races in different leagues, but the Le Mans car specifically was the most iconic because Roy Salvadori and Carroll Shelby drove that car like a bat out of hell right into first place. And in that same year, they had beat Ferrari and Porsche in the World Sports Car Championship in another DBR1. Aston Martin, in just 1 year, went from not being able to finish a race to now being the kings of motorsports. And it was in that same season that they rolled out their all-new race car for Formula One, the DBR4. Of course, their F1 stint was short-lived because they wanted to focus on sports car racing after 1960. But regardless, it seemed like everything was going great for Aston Martin. And the cherry on top was the announcement of the road-going DB4 the following year. That car was freaking beautiful, especially in its GT form, the special lightweight, high-performance version with a 3.7 or 3.8 liter engine that made 302 horsepower, capable of hitting a top speed of 153 miles per hour. Amazing numbers in 1959. But nothing would set Aston Martin apart from the world like their next car, the DB5. The Aston immortalized in the James Bond film. At the heart of the DB5 was an all-aluminum 4-liter inline-six that made 286 horsepower, and the whole car weighed 3,300 pounds. Not quite the race car that the DB4 GT was, but the DB5 was a Grand Touring car at the end of the day. But of course, that wasn't enough for you. The Vantage version made 325 brake horsepower. Side note, little fun story. There were a total of 4 DB5s in the Bond film Goldfinger. 2 for filming and 2 for promotion. One of the filming cars had all the movie gadgets, like all the guns and stuff fitted to it, and the other film car was used for the rolling shots of like just the car without the weaponry. That's cool, but here's where it gets juicy. The promotional cars. Those were both sold off after the press runs, one of which was acquired by a historic car museum in the Netherlands, and the other was sold to be a road car to a British dude. And this is where, as they say in France, le merde hits the fan. You see, that car was the most valuable of the 4 cars because, well, it was made into a real street legal car, not just a movie prop. And the owner, Gavin Kaiser, saw that other replica cars kitted with all the cool movie weapons and stuff were fetching serious money. So he paid a boatload of money to have replica movie parts installed on his legit car, which intrigued a man in Utah, Richard Luce, who bought the car from Kaiser. That's when the car showed up in the Cannonball Run movie. And then Richard decided, I'm gonna retire. Let me offload a couple cars, make a little cash. Boom, the car shows up at an R.M. Sotheby's auction and is sold to a Florida man. And of course, that's where everything goes wrong. The car was stolen from Florida in 1997 right out of the owner's aircraft hangar in Boca. Grundy, their insurance company, also my insurance company, had to pay out the car at 80% of its value to the owner. That guy bought the car for $275,000. Grundy appraised it at $4.2 million. Holy. That car was never seen since, with a $100,000 bounty on the car for any information. Grundy wanted their car back after all, and you can't blame them. They paid out like $3-something million for a car that dude just paid $200. Oh, you think it was an insurance job? I ain't saying that anyone did that. Anyways, 25 years later, the car was discovered. See, in 2021, the Art Recovery International, an organization that specializes in locating lost or stolen luxury items, kind of a crazy thing that exists. I should totally make a TV show about that. They traced the car down to the Middle East. And, well, that's it. That's all we know. No update since then, 2 years later. The organization last gave the current owner the chance to come forward with the car before any further actions had to be taken. But let's be honest, if some super duper rich, good for nothing dude in the Middle East happens to have this stolen car, do you really think he's gonna give it back? If anyone knows what happened since then, please tell me in the comments, or don't. I don't care. Either way, I need to get back to Aston Martin. Come on, eventually. In 1965, the great DB6 comes out. It was beautiful, yada yada yada, just like all the other DBs before it. And then after the DB6 was, you guessed it, the DBS. That's right. Not a DB7, and there wouldn't be another DB7 for like 22 years. Because instead of creating a successor to the DB6, they made the DBS and offered it at the same time. Because Aston Martin was kind of losing to Ford, GM, and Chrysler. The American muscle car craze in the late 60s and early 70s was huge. And so Aston Martin got to a point where they even threw in a 5.3 liter V8 in the car, making it the fastest 4-seater production car in the world. And that was great, but where was the DB7? Well, the DB7 didn't happen. That's because the great David Brown was done. He had paid off all of Aston Martin's debts by 1972, and then he sold the company off. It was bought by an investment bank who eventually sold it to some North American businessman, Peter Sprague. And under his ownership, we got a couple cool cars like the V8 Vantage in 77, the 170 mile an hour car that made Aston the only British supercar maker at the time. And they also made the Volante in 78, and then there were plans to build the Bulldog, doesn't start with a V, a 5.3 liter V8 twin turbo sports car. But they only made one of those because it was so dang expensive to build. And as you're probably starting to get, at this point, Aston had been through half a dozen owners at least, and each of them more or less had something to contribute to Aston Martin's legacy. And well, to completely derail that was the next owner, who honestly did more or less nothing for the company, Victor Gauntlet. I shouldn't complain though. Mr. Gauntlet at least kept the company afloat, and then continued the long tradition of Aston Martin owners with cool names, and he also brought the Aston back to the James Bond series. But after he had his fun, Mr. Gauntlet sold the majority of Aston Martin to Ford. And contrary to what you might expect, Ford honored the company's reputation. They're not GM after all. Aston was on the verge of releasing the V8 Virage during its sale to Ford, so technically that was the first Ford-owned Aston Martin sold to the public. Shortly after that, they released a new Vantage, loosely resembling the Virage it was based on, but under the hood was a twin supercharged V8 that made 550 horsepower. And then to further prove that Ford was interested in honoring the Aston Martin legacy, they did the unthinkable. They announced the DB7. Now, we just made a whole video about how Jaguar had an identity crisis its entire life, and here we are showing the other side of the coin, with Aston Martin always staying true to its roots, consistently making quintessentially British high-performance luxury cars. But you see, this is where those two stories collide, because Ford owned both Aston Martin and Jaguar. And well, it was with the DB7 that the identity of Aston Martin got a little murky for the first time. And that's because the DB7 looks a lot like a Jag. And that wasn't by accident. Basically, Jaguar had been working on a true E-Type successor in the early 80s, basically the F-Type but 40 years ago. And that project failed due to a number of reasons, and when Ford took over, the Jaguar prototype was handed off to Tom Walkinshaw Racing, where they placed a man named Ian Callum in charge of it. And Ian Callum pushed hard to make this E-Type successor a reality, but the accountants upstairs just weren't having it. It just didn't make sense for a failing company at the time to make a daring and expensive car, so Ian's team had an idea. They went down the hall to Aston Martin. And well, Aston said, the deal is this. If you can make it look more like an Aston and less like a Jag, then we'll bankroll this operation. And just like that, the DB7 was born. And well, it may have not been totally Aston Martin, but honestly, it was a pretty cool car with a 3.2-liter inline-six originally, and later the DB7 Vantage with a 5.9-liter V12, which, fun fact, many say was two Ford Duratec V6 engines welded together. Now, that's not actually true. There's a ton of engine internal differences, but they still share a lot of components. And hey, I'm not complaining. I'm just pointing out the resourcefulness of Aston Martin at the time. And as for David Brown, the DB himself, and what he thought of this hodgepodge DB7, well, we'll never know. David Brown passed away in 1993. And whether he liked it or not, he was forever immortalized in those two little letters on the back of Aston Martins to this day. After the DB7, they released the V12 Vanquish in 2001, inspired by the DB4 Zagato, and once again an effort by Aston to stay true to its roots, and then the DB9 to succeed the DB7. The DB9, of course, had the 5.9-liter V12, and well, it was the classic DB formula. It was beautiful, it was powerful, and they took it racing. It won the 12 Hours of Sebring in 2005, hell, it won the GT1 class at Le Mans in 2007 and 2008, but then Aston released another car, one that was not the classic DB formula, one that had some people begin to once again question if Aston was losing the plot. The Aston Martin Rapide. It was 2010, and by now Ford was out of the picture, and Aston Martin had been sold off to an investment group largely based in Kuwait, and these new owners decided they needed a four-door saloon Aston Martin with a V12 in it. And well, the reception was iffy. On one hand, rich dads out of their prime now had a four-door family car option with a V12, and on the other hand, how dare Aston Martin make a family car with four doors, a wheelbase longer than this video, and then waste a V12 in it. And that's not true to its roots. Aston Martin doesn't make four-door cars, but oh well, that's where you're kind of wrong. Let me remind you of Augustus Bertelli, the man who made Aston racing legends, and the madman that made the T-Type back in 1927, a car that came with an extended wheelbase of 9 foot 6 inches and 4 doors. Aston wasn't really reinventing the wheel here, or itself for that matter. Granted, the original T-Type kind of sucked and didn't sell, and the Aston Martin Rapide, well, I don't think it sucked, but it most certainly did not sell. Do I still want an Aston Martin Rapide S? Yes. Yes, I do. So I'll happily bend this car's history to fit my agenda and give the Rapide a pass. But as far as the Aston Martin legacy goes, it never faltered, wavered a bit, sure, but they continued to sell amazing V12 powered sports cars. And then in 2013, Aston Martin signed a deal with Daimler AG, aka Mercedes-Benz. Mercedes got a small chunk of Aston Martin, and in return, Aston Martin gained access to Mercedes technology. A deal that has since allowed Aston Martin to be sold with Mercedes AMG engines. And for a small volume company like Aston, this was a big deal because it took a huge R&D weight off their shoulders. The challenge, however, is how do you make a Mercedes-powered Aston not feel like it came out of Germany? Well, Exhibit A, the DB11. The DB11 was launched in 2016 with an Aston-designed twin-turbo 5.2-liter V12. It made 600 horsepower and sounded the absolute business. But here's the Mercedes twist. 1 year later, in 2017, they offered a cheaper version of the car with a Mercedes AMG 4-liter twin-turbo V8. This version made just 503 horsepower, but it also weighed 250 pounds less. And well, even though it wasn't all Aston, many reviewers said that the V8 was just as good of an option as the V12. That V12, by the way, was available all the way up until they discontinued the DB11 in 2023. A V12 in 2023 when everyone else was going electric. That was huge for Aston Martin and honestly showed their intention to continue making awesome Aston Martin sports cars. Of course, its successor, the DB12, changed that. The DB12 dropped the V12 and instead only had the Mercedes 4-liter V8, now making 671 horsepower. And as much as I really want to complain, I can't. In an age when manufacturers like Jaguar and Lotus are all making promises of less cylinders and more electricity, Aston Martin still sells twin-turbo V8 fire-breather GT cars like the Vantage and DB12, along with the Vanquish, which still comes with the 5.2 V12. Of course, they did still fall into the SUV trap with the Aston Martin DBX. But at this point, who can really blame them for playing the market? And at the very least, their focus seems to be more Porsche than Jaguar. The DBX, unlike the Rapide, was reviewed pretty well, with a lot of people saying that it drove excellently. And Aston Martin overall are continuing to build cars that are part and parcel to their core identity, while using motorsports as a testbed for future technology, not just half-assing some EV project because they can. Case in point, the Valhalla, an 817 horsepower twin-turbo V8 hypercar assisted by 2 electric motors. But the crazy part is, that's not even their coolest car, or the most expensive. The $3.5 million Valkyrie, an 1,139 horsepower V12 hybrid hypercar, or the Valiant, a much cheaper $2.5 million 734 horsepower V12 hypercar with a 6-speed manual if you're a little cheap. But if that's still too much money for you, okay, you can have the Aston Martin Valor, a $2 million 700 horsepower V12 6-speed manual supercar. And okay, sure, those aren't really realistic because the rest of us can totally afford regular Aston Martins. But see, in September of last year, Aston announced the 3rd generation Vanquish. And well, it still got the V12. This time making 824 horsepower paired to a ZF 8-speed auto, and it costs less than a quarter of what the Valor costs, $432,000. Okay, look, they're not making cars for my tax bracket, but I can still respect that Aston Martin continues to keep their eye on the ball, making high quality cars and then proving that quality on the track, just like they did 100+ years ago. Which, thanks to a minority stake bought by Lawrence Stroll, also means the Formula 1 track, because Aston Martin is back in F1. All that to say, while some brands continue to chase trends and leave behind what made them truly great, Aston Martin stands firm, a reminder that legacy and innovation can truly coexist. And I think it's because of that very reason that Aston Martin has continued to survive through many different owners and many different iterations up and down to this very day, which is pretty much the exact opposite of what Jaguar is doing. And you can learn about that sad story by clicking this video right here. Thanks for watching.